Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone in-house to make a courtesy check one more time that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. Our internet viewers, of course, are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org, and we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference following today's presentations. Hosting our discussion is Dr. James J. Carafano. Dr. Carafano is Vice President of our Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He is also the E.W. Richardson Fellow. He serves as a Senior Fellow at the George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute, on the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation, as well as advisory boards for the West Point Center on Oral History, the Hamilton Society, and Operation Renewed Hope Foundation. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and the Institute of World Politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Carafano. Jim?
I'm sorry. All I can think of is a Three Stooges routine. Doctor. So,
and it's at 3 p.m. too.
so we have two distinguished speakers today. Dr. Bill Imboden is the Executive Director of the Clements Center and Associate Professor of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. And Dr. Kim Holmes is a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And what really makes this kind of a fascinating panel for me is the intertwine of their bios, which I won't read, but they both had distinguished federal service in the inner workings of government in some of the most trying and contentious foreign policy and national security times of recent memory. They both have had times in think tank and academia. So they're part of that small cadre of who have walked the walk, talked the talk, and then gone back and thought about it. And they've both gotten to see both the Bush years and the Obama years from different and interesting perspectives. And so I couldn't really think of two better people to answer the question that I want to pose, particularly since recently Bill and Kim have authored a series of articles in foreign policy kind of framing and addressing the issue that I pose. So I thought what was fascinating about the State of the Union address is that I think even the president would say, and regardless of whether you like his strategy and policies or whatever, I don't even think the president would say that he answered the question about where do we go from here, right? I mean, might like his assessment on the State of the Union or not, but there was nothing in that speech about what is the future. And actually, administrations talked about that very little. And so I think that's the question that I kind of pose to the panel. So maybe I would open up with Bill, right, to maybe talk a little bit about where the heck are we, and then maybe Kim can say, well, what's the so what of that? Where do we go from here? Does that make sense? And then I think I might have a few questions, and then we'll open up to discussions. Just so you're ready, and hopefully we can get a lot of discussion going. If you do have a question or a comment, if you just raise your hand, I'll recognize you. And if you wait for the microphone, because we're also recording this, and then people are also listening online, and before you ask your question, so everybody gets to hear it, and then if you would just kind of state your name and affiliation, that would be awesome. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Bill, and then Kim can just jump right on that. So.
All right.
Doctor?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jim. It's an honor to be here. I can't help but notice that a few of my former students are in the audience, Denise, Rachel, Peter, calling you guys out. Now, on the one hand, that's flattering for a professor to have your students, after they've graduated, still be willing to show up and hear you. But it's also a little daunting because it means I can't use the same stories and jokes that they've heard so many times, or else you'll see them falling asleep. So consider them my accountability mechanisms. And on a somewhat more sobering note, I also was realizing as I was walking here that the last time I sat up here was maybe about a year and a half ago with Rich Williamson, now the late Rich Williamson. And a tremendous man, a great American, a great public servant, a font of ideas and energy on foreign policy. And at the time he was in great health, and we had no idea how quickly we'd lose him. So a reminder of the transience of life. So let us all count the days and make the most of them. I also say it was just a real honor to give credit where credit is due. The idea for this series of articles, now turning into a forthcoming ebook here from Heritage, originated entirely with Kim. And I was honored when he would reach out to me and ask me to be a co-author, co-laborer, co-partner in this endeavor. But really, all credit to him for initiating it and for coming up with so many of the great ideas. I was honored to be a part of helping fill in some of the details. I will, of course, you'll hear both of us encourage all of you to read the articles, read the ebook as you have occasion. So we won't just sit up here and recite it for you, but rather maybe what we can do is provide a little bit more context for why we undertook this, what we hope it might accomplish, and maybe where we are at this particular moment in American foreign and defense policy history. Our book starts with cataloging a lot of the challenges besetting America in the world today. And reading it, you'll see that it is a series of criticisms of what we see as a number of missteps that the Obama administration has made. And we can perhaps go through those, particularly in the Q&A time. But to give a little bit of context and some fairness, particularly with a couple of Bush administration alums here, when President Obama was elected in November of 2008, when he took office in January of 2009, he inherited a tough hand. Certainly the global financial crisis first and foremost, but he inherited an Afghanistan that was eroding and backsliding. He inherited a difficult relationship with Russia from their invasion of Georgia in August of 2008. And he inherited a United States where our soft power quotient, if you will, was still somewhat diminished on the global stage. So insofar as 2008 was a foreign policy election, it was American voters more or less, I think, rejecting what they saw as at the time as the Bush foreign policy. I do want to say in fairness that I think what was less appreciated by the voters and the Obama administration at the time is a number of other ways that the Bush administration handed over them a strong hand. Much improved relations with our European allies, with then Sarkozy in France, with the UK, with Merkel in Germany. A pretty united international coalition against Russian aggression, some tools there. The creation of the G20 to help have a coordinated response to the global, coordinated international response to the global financial crisis. A counterterrorism infrastructure that, for all of its weaknesses and imperfections, had succeeded in the meta goal, which was protecting the United States from another large-scale attack on the homeland. We may take that for granted now, but those of us who are here in Washington on September 11th or New York, or even remember that day wherever you were, at the time, the days and weeks afterwards, it would have been inconceivable to us. I was here then. It would have been inconceivable if you would have told me that over the next 7 years we won't have another large-scale attack on the homeland, let alone for the next 14 years as we are now approaching. And finally, while the American public was in 2008 when Obama was elected was weary of Iraq, the Obama administration was handed a better hand on Iraq. They were handed an Iraq that was an emerging, stable, peaceful place thanks to the surge. There was tremendous blood and treasure invested in that. There were tremendous mistakes made by the Bush administration. Which Kim and I were honored to serve. So this is not to relitigate Iraq, but rather say that Iraq in November of 2008 was potentially an emerging success story. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the predecessor to ISIS, was very nearly defeated. Was really on its back heels. And so when the Obama administration came into office, one of my criticisms then and now was they made an understandable but still regrettable political mistake, which is they fell into the anything but Bush pattern. Whatever those Bush people did, we're going to reject it. When, in fact, I think a more careful assessment would have been the Bush people got a lot of things right and got some things wrong. And a more astute approach would have been let's embrace the things that are, campaign rhetoric is over. We're moving beyond that. Let's embrace the things that were done right, and then let's correct the things that were done wrong. Now, in hindsight, as we look at the last 6 years of Obama foreign policy, and again, as you'll see in our book, we catalog a number of the deficiencies there. The big question is still why? Why has American foreign policy, if you by our arguments been so disappointing over the last 6 years, especially when there was the potential, when a relatively strong hand, I think, was inherited in January 2009 when President Obama took the oath of office. And the, not even, I was going to say the dirty little secret around town, but not even so secret anymore, is that you won't find a lot of defenders of Obama administration foreign policy these days outside the White House. If you look at the likes of Dennis Ross, Michelle Flournoy, Leon Panetta, Hillary Clinton, General Flynn, who just stepped down from DIA, Vali Nasser, a lot of people who served in senior positions, even cabinet-level positions in the Obama administration, have been publicly very critical. And so there's emerging consensus among most Democrats and a lot of Republicans that what's been tried has not been working. And what has been tried, I think that Kim and I catalog a lot of the detailed specifics of policies in our book, but overarching this was what seems to have been a deliberate effort by the Obama administration to have America pull back from its global leadership role. Leading from behind was the phrase that an Obama staff member used in an interview with the New Yorker. And I think there's a lot to criticize there, but in fairness, to first understand it, there is a certain internal coherence to this worldview, even an assumption that was perhaps worth trying, which is that the United States has been carrying the burden of the global superpower and undergirding international security, open maritime order, peace and stability around the world for the last 70 years, especially since the end of the Cold War. And it's expensive and it's exhausting, and we're feeling a little overstretched, and it's time for the rest of the world to step up. So you hear the Obama White House often invoke the phrase of nation building at home, and we're going to kind of pull back from our commitments overseas. We're going to cut the defense budget. We're going to get out of Iraq. We're going to draw down from Afghanistan. We're not going to be too confrontational in Europe or the Asia Pacific, and like I said, there's a certain internal coherence to that. I think it was the wrong strategy. I think events have borne that out, but at least give some credit where credit was due. But there was a big flaw in it, is it didn't answer the then what question. In terms of if America pulls back, then what, or then what will happen, or then who will step in to provide those goods of international peace and stability and security. The last time this happened on the global stage was at the end of World War II, when the British, who'd been our important allies in the war, realized they were bankrupt and exhausted. Heritage's Ted Broman could discourse at some length, actually at quite a bit of length about this, but okay. But he's here all the time, so listen to me today. You just got me for the afternoon. But I'll give the British this. There was a certain, I think, strategic calculus of understanding that as they were stepping back from, maintaining the global international liberal order, that someone else needed to step up and take their place. And so there was a somewhat intentional handing over of that role to the United States, very specifically with the Truman Doctrine, when the British could no longer provide their security guarantees to Greece and Turkey. Some of this was by accident, but some of this was by design. Well, if in 2008, 2009, we're at a similar moment where the United States needs to step back and and no longer assume the burdens of being the global superpower. Okay, that's plausible, but who's going to step in and take our place? Well, wasn't the UN, wasn't NATO, wasn't the EU, certainly. Rather, it seems to have been Russia and China, and then in the Middle East, even the Islamic State. And Russia, China, and the Islamic State are all very different, but one thing they have in common is they don't share the same values as the United States, and they certainly are not being responsible international actors. And so that, I think, was the overarching strategic flaw in the Obama administration's assumption and experiment about what does the world look like with the United States pulling back a bit. And we could perhaps take this up in some more in the discussion time. But what does this mean for the United States? Just because all these challenges are besetting the international order, do we actually have the capabilities to resume a strong internationalist American leadership role? And this is where, again, Kim can go through this a little bit more in his remarks, but one thing we tried to do is provide an inventory. What are America's strengths and capabilities? What would be the net assessment of what we can bring to the table? In some areas, a number of economic challenges, still diminished soft power, diminished force projection capabilities with our defense cuts. In some ways, we're certainly not as strong as we were, say, 10, 15 years ago. However, power is measured in relative terms. It's not just about what's the size of the American military, the size of our economy. It's what's the size of our economy, what are our capabilities in comparison with the rest of the world. And again, here's another dirty little secret of international politics. As much as we can focus on the challenges that the United States has, I guarantee you that any other international leader, any other head of state of any other country would in a minute switch places with us and would like to have what the United States has and the hand that we have to play. And so in relative terms, I'm still fairly optimistic about American capabilities. And we, whether it's looking at the shale revolution and us now being essentially the world's largest energy producer and exporter, would have been unfathomable even 10 years ago, gives us tremendous latitude and freedom of action. And at the same time, it's really hurting some of our adversaries, such as the Iranians or the Russians or the Venezuelans, who can do a lot more mischief when oil is $100 a barrel than they can when it's 40 or 45 a barrel. And we go through a number of other things there. And then the final comment I'll make is there is the question of public opinion, particularly as we're preparing for the next presidential election cycle. Kim and I timed our articles that we hope to be at the leading edge of speaking into that debate, as there's going to be, I think, a lively debate among Republican candidates in a very wide open primary over foreign policy, national security. Likewise, for Hillary Clinton, the presumed Democratic frontrunner, she has a challenge here in terms of, on the one hand, she served in the Obama administration. She was his Secretary of State. She can't distance herself too much from that, but she has spoken of some of her frustrations there. So she's going to have to lay out her foreign policy vision. And the question is, what will the American people support? If you look at public opinion data, it's conflicted. On the one hand, a lot of it's how do you phrase the questions. You've asked things like, should the United States be launching more wars to topple dictators in messy places like the Middle East and sending in ground troops? Well, you'll get about 80% of Americans saying no. But if you say things like, should the United States retreat from global leadership and allow the bad actors of the world to have a stronger hand? Well, oh, no, Americans don't like that either. You hear a lot of talk about the American people being exhausted from 14 years of war, from Afghanistan being our longest war, from Iraq. On the one hand, I understand that. We have dealt with a lot of that in our headlines. It has been a financial drain. But on the other hand, I think we take that way too far because the vast majority of Americans have not suffered from those wars. It's been the military that has borne the brunt of that. And the all-volunteer force is the most effective fighting force in American history. But as we've had fewer and fewer Americans serving in uniform or even knowing people who serve in uniform, I think there's been a real cultural disconnect where a lot of the rest of us just don't appreciate the burdens that the military has borne. So I'm much more sympathetic to those who say the military is exhausted from repeated deployments and the wars. For the American people, I think that's maybe giving us a little too much credit. So, what would public opinion support today? This is where I think we have a mistake if we think of public opinion as static and something politicians and political leaders only respond to. Yeah, that's part of it. You need to know what the American people are thinking, but the American people also respond to leadership. And I think and hope that if a strong case is made to the American people by whichever Republican candidates, perhaps by Secretary Clinton as well, on the importance of American global leadership, the importance of restoring our defense budget, the importance of restoring international economic leadership, and the importance of leading a coalition of the free world to curb the behavior of a lot of these bad actors out there. I'm optimistic that the American people will support that if they're given a plausible reason why, and if the case is made to them. I think that there's certainly an intuitive intelligence in the average American voter, as well as a good sense of values. And if they understand that our country has historically played this role and has the capability to play it again, then I think the case can be made. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kim and his reflections, and we'll look forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you very much, Will. And thank all of you for coming this afternoon. I would like to take credit for the idea, but actually it was Jim's idea. Thank you.
No wonder he was elbowing me when I was training camp. Okay,
yeah.
sir.
I'd like to take credit for the idea. It was actually Ted's idea.
No, the boss is always given the credit, right, Jim? Yeah. But it was really a pleasure to be able to work both with Jim, particularly with Will, though, on this particular project. I got to know Will when I was in the State Department. He was working over in the NSC in the Bush administration, and learned that he was a man that was not only knew his way around the academic subject, but also could do the operational side of foreign policy and diplomacy very well. And it was just when we were thinking about who to do this with, we naturally thought that you would be a good partner. Will mentioned that the central thesis of these series of articles is this idea that Barack Obama and his presidency came to office with the idea that it was their intention to pull the United States back from its traditional role as a world leader, and to actually intentionally disengage if pretty much across the board, with the assumption that the Bush administration made all the mistakes that you talked about, and it was sort of a reaction that was born partly out of the politics of the campaign, the presidential campaign. But I also think that the president and those around him sincerely believed, both strategically and even ideologically, that there needed to be a very severe course correction. On the one hand, I suppose if you want to take the broad view, and you were just doing that, this is somewhat understandable, as you were saying. But I also think there's a part of it that was truly new. But what was understandable about it is this would not be the first time that the United States foreign policy sort of overlearned the mistakes of the previous 10 years. We have been doing this for well over a century. If you look at the lesson that supposedly Americans and the Western Allied powers from World War I had learned from that war, the lesson there was supposedly, well, it was an accidental war. We stumbled into it by being too overly aggressive. And so therefore the lesson from that is to pull back, try to find international arms control agreements, peace agreements, and the like, the whole philosophy of the 1920s, both in 30s, both in Europe and in here. And the Americans sort of internalized it by saying, well, we don't want to become engaged in European affairs, and that led sort of to the quasi-isolationism of the 1920s and 30s. Well, we know what happened in the power vacuum. Adolf Hitler rose, and then the lesson we learned from that is, well, we can't make that mistake again. We need to be engaged, and we need to have deterrence. That was the philosophy that led us, of course, after the burning experience of World War II, to establish the whole doctrine of deterrence that pretty much motivated us during the Cold War. The problem is in the Cold War strategies, we hadn't quite integrated the experience or what to do with the hot wars in the Cold War. And this, of course, is the experiences of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, where the peaceful side of the Cold War, if you will, more or less worked very well, at least worked well to the point that we didn't have a major war with the Soviet Union, but we still had these wars on the peripheries. And then it was the failure of one of those hot wars during the Cold War, the Vietnam War, that led to another swing in the pendulum in the other direction. It was conceived to be a failure of being overly aggressive. The result of that was Jimmy Carter's presidency, a pulling back and sort of reverting back to some of the assumptions of the 20s and 30s. And then what happened then? It's the same thing that happened in the previous decades. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And then Ronald Reagan came in. You can just see the pendulum swinging back and forth. Every time there is a crisis or a trauma, we rush to the other side and almost overcompensate for it. And I think that there is a part of that with Barack Obama, in the sense that where in the Gulf War, it was supposed to be the cakewalk. We could do nothing wrong. We drew from that, therefore, that we could do a war like Iraq. It was anything but a cakewalk. Then the war in Iraq was very difficult, and then the conclusion was we can't do anything right. Nothing could be done right, and therefore we must be pulling back. So I think that's where the American people were, in addition to all the things that you were saying. But this is where I think that the Obama administration brought in something new, and that was different from Jimmy Carter and different from these other instances that I mentioned historically. And that is, I think that he and those around him truly believed that America was part of the problem. Whatever the problem was that we faced in the world, it was a result not just of the Iraq War, but overextension in general. And the result that particularly the Islamic world and the Arab world thought that they had a grievance against us, and he understood that, and he was going to reverse that. And I think that is where he ideologically and strategically got it wrong. It wasn't just the pendulum swinging back and forth and going too far. I think that his actual analysis of what was happening in the world was flawed. Now, as a result of that, we argue in this piece that because of this flawed conclusion about what was really wrong with the world, we have found that the experiment that he actually did try to implement over the last 6 years has actually made the world much more unstable. There's large swaths of territory now that are ungovernable. There are new havens for terrorist groups that didn't exist before. The three biggest disappointments that we have seen over the last 6 years, in my opinion, is that terrorism is not only back with a vengeance, but it's back in a form that is much more difficult to deal with. It's better funded, it's much more dangerous, it's linked up with indigenous movements inside each of our countries here in Europe and elsewhere. Also, the relationship with Russia was very badly managed. It's more than ironic that when the president kept on talking against Governor Romney and even the Bush administration about having a so-called Cold War mentality and wanting to move beyond the Cold War, it is in fact on his watch that we now have a new Cold War with Russia. Perhaps it's even worse than a Cold War in the sense that inside in the boundaries of Europe, he is using force, the Russians are using force to try to change the borders of Europe and are challenging the post-Cold War era arrangement and order in Europe. And then finally, something that's not talked about very much, I wish more of it would be talked about. Jim and his staff talk about it a lot, and that is the weakening of America's military power and capabilities. This is happening below the radar screen, and frankly, it's not just President Obama's fault. Some Republicans have joined in weakening our defenses. Sequestration, of course, is holding national defense hostage to our disagreements over taxes and budget. And I just don't know if we're going to get out of that. And if it looks like if we blow over the caps on sequestration again, we're going to have even more devastating cuts in the capability of our armed forces. So the question is what do you do about it? And I think the starter is that whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, you have to realize that the hole we're in that we've been digging is not working, and there has to be a fundamental change of perspective. That the experiment of withdrawing from the world has not worked. The world's got more disordered, the threats have gotten worse, and it's not just because of George W. Bush. It's actually because of things that have happened over the last 6 years. And I think there needs to be a much more comprehensive and coherent strategy on our counterterrorism. And this means that we have to realize is that safe havens that are now proliferating across the globe in places where we used to be and now abandoned, like Iraq, and the consequences of the Syrian conflict are making this worse. This is a hard nut to crack. I will grant you that. No one wants to have any more military interventions and the like, but you can't just simply abandon large parts of the world to become safe haven for terrorists. We need to have a bipartisan support for restoring our national defenses, which means that we have to do something about sequestration and have to be spending more on national defense. I think also we need to be more realistic and about the Russian policy that we have been in the past. I don't think the Europeans have the patience to stay on the sanctions path with the Russians forever. They're going to need strong leadership at some point. The Italians and the French and even the Germans are always looking for a way out. They want to return to normal in Europe in a very, very bad way. And if they can find a way of doing it, if the Russians perhaps were a little bit more clever in the way they were doing things, they could give them a way out. And so this is where we cannot simply let them lead this effort. The United States has to be more involved. The last thing is that Will mentioned this. You mentioned this in passing, and I've been hearing this as I go around town to meetings and conferences and the like. There are not a lot of Democrats or liberals who today are very fond of what President Obama has done in foreign policy. In private, they will tell you that they're embarrassed by it. They're angry that the situation has gotten worse. They often talk about it in terms of mismanagement rather than ideology or strategy, but nonetheless, there is a concern about this. And of course, as you mentioned, Hillary Clinton, I think, is politically looking for some way to distance herself, which will be very difficult given the fact that she was Secretary of State, but she is looking for it. Now, what is that? That's the politics of it, but the policy of it means is that if this anxiety is rising up, there may be a chance for people who are less politically involved to find some kind of common ground between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives on trying to turn this situation around. I know that this is a political town. I don't expect too much from it, but it's not what I would have said a couple of years ago when we seemed to be locked in ideological combat. I think also, number two, that conservatives in foreign policy are at a crossroads. On the one hand, over the last few years, some conservatives have become enamored of the libertarian critique of past foreign policies of the Republican politics. You know all of these, I'm sure, if you've been following foreign policy, you know about these arguments. But that's not the only thing that's happening in the conservative circles. You also find some people who fashion themselves or are called by others neoconservatives starting to flirt with Hillary Clinton and with the Democrats, reacting to that libertarianism, if you will, by wanting to return to the fold of the Democratic Party. Now, there's only a few individuals that we know of that are doing this. I think that most of the people that you would call neoconservatives, like Bill Kristol and others, are not doing that. So I don't want to make too much of this, but it is there, and it's an interesting trend. I think that conservatives in general, it's very important that we keep the strong national defense and the Reagan peace through strength mantle politically and philosophically for a couple of reasons. One is that conservatives are the political anchor of a strong national defense and the political system and the political process. If conservatives abandon that, there is no other anchor. The Democrats are not going to provide it. And moderates are not going to provide it. And without that, you will see more of the kind of drift that we have been describing here today that you've seen under the Obama administration. I just don't really expect even a Hillary Clinton to make a strong enough case for a strong America, even if she does have some so-called neocons in her supporting her. I think also conservatives have to be a bit wary of what I would call sort of liberal ideology creeping into their worldview through the back door. In other words, not knowing that it truly is liberal ideology. They think it's something else or calling it something else. I would be concerned that worrying too much about military interventionism can, in some cases, become almost indistinguishable from what the far left believes in its anti-Americanism. You have to make distinctions between the government and the nation and the people. I think also that a desire to cut spending, which is something we all want to do, could, if it's too much exaggerated, can evolve into almost an anti-military kind of thinking. And then also, there are some cases where you can even see some sort of liberal definitions of human rights I could see creeping in through the back door into the conservative worldview. I only raise that as a flag. I don't think it's happening in any great way, but I could see if under certain circumstances where it could become more than it is. The last thing I would say is that, and we'll refer to this, and I think he's absolutely right, is I would not make too much of this thesis that Americans are world weary. That they're depressed and bored or just entirely preoccupied with their Twitters and their Facebooks in Hollywood. I mean, Americans are always going to be more interested in this sort of thing than they are what we're talking about up here. This is absolutely nothing new. This is where leadership.
That's why we're not doing this panel at Redskins Stadium, right?
That's right. That's right. You know, I'm lucky we got this many people.
Even the Redskins couldn't draw a crowd to this Redskins Stadium.
But Americans do respond to leadership. If they have a president of the United States and strong leaders who go out and make a compelling case for why Americans must sacrifice for something, and it's reasonable and it works, and if it's successful, then they will support it. What they won't put up with is fecklessness and incompetence. And unfortunately, we've got a bit of both of that right now. And that can come from either political party. We had a bit of that in our own administration, I hate to say. So you have to be both firm in your views and clear in your views, but you also have to be competent and demanding competence. Americans demanding competence in foreign policy from their leaders is something that is hard to do, but I think it really must be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So again, if you have a question, if you just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. I've got a couple of questions I want to leave with, but just bear with me for a second and we'll get started here. I would want to go back again and thank both Kim and Bill for doing this. Kim's been working on a book, so he had to tear himself away for that. Bill's had a whirlwind schedule in town meeting with all kinds of people, so making time for this has really been extraordinary. I appreciate that. So I did have just a few things I just wanted to go back over to make sure I'm even clear in my own mind about the case that you guys are making here. So one is well, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think it's okay. Talking about feckless, somebody in the staff said, this is leading from behind. The administration never embraced that as a strategy. I don't think it accurately describes a strategy. I think it's unfair to clarify that way. And I actually thought you came closer to framing what the president would actually say he thinks he's doing if he were here. And is this some kind of this notion of if you can get the world to status quo, then we've reached a stability which doesn't require America to do as much. And this notion of getting the world to status quo is a combination of, in some case, us not doing things and other people doing them instead, and the case of people that we're competing with or angry with, either satisfying their equities or giving them a stake or giving them a stake in the system, and that if you do these actions right, you're going to get to some kind of global equilibrium, which doesn't require the United States, in a sense, to be so proactive. I think that's so. My first question for you really is. What's wrong with that idea? Is his vision wrong, or were the tactics that they've been doing it the last 6 years inadequate?
No, it's a great question. To answer it in a sentence, I do think the vision and the values are wrong. It's been hindered even more by ham-handed tactics, so that's obscured it. But this is where rhetoric matters, and there is the progressive worldview. You hear this talked about a lot. Well, what's the root word there? It's progress, and it's a belief that history inevitably marches in a certain direction. And so, what was the Obama administration's criticism of Putin when he first invaded Ukraine? You heard this from Ben Rhodes. You heard this from Secretary Kerry. You heard it from President Obama himself. What was their criticism? That's straight out of the 19th century. Well, maybe it was or maybe it wasn't, but unpack that for a second. What's wrong with the 19th century? There's an implicit thing that as each century goes by, the world gets better and better and progress happens, and that the 20th century will inevitably be this place of naturally occurring, the natural order being peace and prosperity and stability, perhaps with a little bit of help from some multilateral bodies like the United Nations. I think history moves in more ambivalent directions. I would say the conservative worldview embraces a little bit more of a sense of the tragic. There's plenty of room for optimism in the conservative worldview. I mean, at its worst, it's just pure gloom and doom all the time, and that's not the way the world works either. I believe progress can happen. I also believe regression can happen. I think the world is both a better and a worse place now than the 19th century, okay? The 19th century didn't have the threat of nuclear holocaust and chemical and biological weapons, and didn't have, Islamist terrorists flying planes into buildings, killing 3,000 people, trying to kill 3 million more. That's better. Okay, I'll take that part of the 19th century, but we can also, I won't, obviously I'm a history professor. I won't tell you all the things we don't want about the 19th century either. But the larger point is there is a certain, I think, progressive worldview that assumes that things are just inevitably getting better, and all we need to do is kind of tut at the occasional tin pot dictator out there who didn't get the message of how to behave in the 21st century. So rather, I do think that progress is possible, but it needs effort and it needs constant maintenance. And that's the key thing, is that the hard-won gains of the better world that we're in now than World War II, or then even the Cold War, can be eroded, can be lost without active maintenance. And that's what I think has been the fundamental flaw in the Obama administration's worldview.
Okay, so this keys up my question for Kim. So
Okay.
I want to answer that one.
No, wait, hang on, wait. So, not to beat a dead horse. I mean, so if you're making the argument that fundamentally this won't work, right? So then the real question is, and this is a rhetoric question, is what is the narrative for what will work, right? So we've had this framing of, well, the choices are between you can be a neocon or you can be an isolationist, right? And the president himself said, well, that's not right. And the way he framed it in the West Point speech is between you can do everything, and that's wrong, and you do nothing, and that's wrong. So we need to do something, right? So the president's kind of made his case for something. You say it doesn't work, right? So now the question is if that's not the something, what's the something we can all believe in? I think you both mentioned the fact that how it's been interesting that even people that didn't like the Bush foreign policy and defense at all are now really walking away from Obama's defense and foreign policy, to the point that I think it's not a stretch to say that nobody will be running for president in 2016 saying 8 more years of Obama foreign defense policy. Even if Joe Biden's the candidate for president, he's not going to do that, right? They may use more gentler words, but nobody's going to endorse this. So my question for you, Kim, well, what's the something that people can believe in other than nothing or everything?
Yeah. Well, I don't have the slogan yet. I know that the slogans that we've used in the past will not work. It has to be perceived as something new. But I think it will be grounded in trying to correct what the fundamental mistake was. And I think that President Obama, he underestimated how important the United States was as a linchpin in the international order, and particularly with respect to the safety and security of our allies in the world, in the places where they were, in Europe and the Middle East. I think he thought that we really were indispensable in many ways. And I think equilibrium is too strong of a word. It implies it's almost static. It's not static at all. But the fact is that people depend on us. And if it's perceived that we're not going to be there to back up our allies, they're going to start making their own arrangements. And that creates even more instability than existed before. Or if you have a situation like, for example, with respect to the Russians, and it's not just what happened with the reset policy, it's also the administration intentionally let the European Union take the lead in trying to figure out what to do about Ukraine. And if you recall, what caused the revolution inside Ukraine, which caused the backlash against the Russians, was the fact that Ukraine was going to become closely associated with the European Union. And that wasn't even part of a NATO problem. The United States wasn't even there, and it can still blow up in your face. If we had been more engaged, perhaps in other areas, we could have managed that better. We could have managed the Syria situation better, and yet we pulled back. And so it's not just allies and friends making their own arrangements. It's also adversaries and enemies like Putin and others thinking they had opportunities they didn't have before. And so you end up getting a much more unstable situation than you had before. So American leadership defined in that way as engaged in trying to control not only events, but trying to control America's destiny. We don't want to give up control of our own destiny. We want to be able to make sure that our values matter and try to maintain our own security. That is something, if you can find the right slogan for, most Americans will agree to. But we need to get beyond all of these black and white dichotomies of war or no war, engagement or no engagement. This is not even close to solving the real problem we have. And so you end up having to have a bottom-up kind of assessment, which is what we've done, by identifying what the specific problems are and then recommending specific things. And then, you can let the politicians come up with the slogans.
Okay. So, and that's actually where we're going to go next, is the last questions, and then we'll go to the phone. So you're basically making a case for a restatement of American leadership. Yeah. Then you go through these articles, and you laid out here kind of a nice triage to-do list of kind of these are the first three things that need to get done. And you talked about a new Russia strategy, a new defense investment strategy, which I guess indirectly also addresses the concerns about China and balance in Asia. And then you talk about the need for revitalizing a new counterterrorism strategy.
Right.
So I get that. So those are all kind of, roll up your sleeves kind of dirty work. Do you guys have any on the other side for the things, constructive, positive things that you would have a new administration jump into? Trade or other things?
Yes. And thanks for the hand. He reminded me, yes. Okay. That was called a lead-in question. You're forgetting something, Kim. Yes. We have also abandoned the field on international economics and trade. And in Asia, particularly in East Asia, China is filling the gap there. But it's not just TTIP or TPP and others and fast track. These are all the sort of things that are short-term that we need to be doing that we're not doing better. But we also need to have an integrated trade and economic strategy for this hemisphere, which we did have some 15, 20 years ago, but we've abandoned it. Ever since NAFTA passed, we don't have anything in our trade relations with Latin America. And so if we're not present commercially and economically in trade around the world, then we're always going to be playing catch-up on the military side because there will always be more economic instability than there should be. Most of these countries that don't want to, not everything is about war. It's also about trade and making money and the like. And we have not been the kind of actor that we should be. I don't think this administration much cares about it, but I'm not so sure that many Republicans do either, but they should be.
Yeah, I'll have a couple more things to add, especially picking up on what Kim said about our hemisphere. I mean, one specific thing I've written about before and encouraged is, again, going back to my comments about the energy revolution in the United States. It's not just a United States energy revolution, it's a North American one, all right? So Canada, we've got a very pro-energy friendly government with the Harper government there who are pulling their hair out over Keystone XL, and there's a lot more to it than just Keystone XL. But also south of the border, I mean, I know a lot of the headlines are again about the cartels and the border instability with Mexico, and the Peña Nieto government is having some of its own internal problems. But this guy, Mexico's president has unleashed some tremendous energy reforms, particularly allowing in more outside investment. And so and Mexico is sitting on a lot of untapped oil and gas reserves. And so I've proposed, how about kind of a North American hemispheric energy policy or alliance, where aligning Canada's resources, Mexico's resources, and the United States. It'd be a real win for all three. It'd be a diplomatic win, and I think it would further double down on some advantages we have there. The other one I would mention is the Asia Pacific. When the Obama administration first started talking about the pivot, I wrote an article saying 2 cheers for the pivot in terms of, yeah, this is the right thing to do, but I worried it was just going to be rhetoric, and it has turned out to be just rhetoric, which in some ways is the worst of all, because I traveled throughout the region, especially with our allies, shortly after it was announced, and in Tokyo and Seoul and Canberra, you hear, okay, so you Americans are talking a big game, but are you going to be here? Are you going to deliver? Are you going to come through on the trade agreements? Are you going to have a more reinvigorated diplomatic presence? How are you saying you're going to be shifting military resources here while you have just passed the sequester and you're eviscerating the DoD budget? And a lot of those worries have come to pass. And so I think having a real presence in the Asia Pacific, the regional architecture there is very weak. I think building up stronger multilateral organizations, especially for our allies and emerging partners like India, and this is intended to balance China. I mean, I think we can just be candid about that. It was kind of a game in our government for the last 15 years. If you can't say we're trying to balance China, well, of course we're trying to balance China, just as they're trying to balance us and squeeze us out of the region. And frankly, our relationship with China will be better if it's more honest. The Chinese respect honesty, and I think if they see us playing a more honest, strong hand, then we'll actually find some grounds to cooperate with them as well in some areas. But we need to be honest about how they see us, which is as their main competitor.
Okay, so now I've got 3 and 3 now. So
Okay.
Counterterrorism, defense investment, Russian strategy, and on the plus side, trade, energy, and key alliances, particularly in the Pacific. So we have a question over here.
Thank you so much. My name is Arash Ghafouri. I'm a private consultant. My question is regarding to the 2016 presidential election. Does the foreign policy matter for Americans in the elections? I mean, for example, you maybe know that in 2012 and 2014, 2012 presidential election and 2014 midterm election, just 3 to 5 or 6% of Americans vote the candidate based on their foreign policy. So whether you are Secretary Clinton or Government Romney, if you have a plan for economy and you have to plan to recover the economy, so it doesn't matter what your foreign policy is. Actually, the only person can differentiate himself from the others is Rand Paul, but the others, I think that based on their the most important issues the country with right now, right, immigration, right, other things. So it would be much more important than the foreign policy, and people based on the polls don't pay attention to the foreign policy.
Thank you. It's a great question.
Right. I'll take a crack, and then Kim can correct me. So, does foreign policy matter in American presidential elections? Sometimes. I mean, it's always a factor, but when is it a primary factor? As I looked over the last, 30 years or so, I'd say it was a big one in 1980. Reagan running against the Carter foreign policy, the Iran hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a real question of the United States losing the Cold War. I think the next election, probably where foreign policy was a big top-tier issue, probably wasn't until 2004, maybe. Certainly not in 92. If it was in 92, then Bush would have won re-election. But probably 2004, when Bush 43 was running on keeping America safe and Kerry was running as an emerging critic of the Iraq War. Then again, in 2008, I think it was a bit more as well, with Obama running as certainly a critic of Bush foreign policy. 2012, it wasn't a foreign policy election. This one upcoming, still too early to tell, but I do think foreign and defense policy will be much more of an issue in 2016, certainly than it was in 2012. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is that, I mean, it does go up and down given the events. I mean, if there's a major terrorist attack within a year or a couple of months of a presidential election, you'll see the polls about terrorism and foreign policy go right to the top. Right now, they're quite low. So it's very, very dependent on what's happening in the world in terms of public opinion. But I do believe that regardless of that, that every presidential candidate has to pass the threshold of being competent and serious, taken seriously in foreign policy. There has to be a certain amount of gravitas where the American people think, yeah, I think I could trust that person with the presidency, with national security. It doesn't necessarily, that particular point doesn't have any direct ideological content, but it does have a leadership aspect to it that's almost, it's hard to kind of nail down exactly what that is. But I do think, I agree with Will, that I think foreign policy, because of all the things that we're talking about here, will be more of an interest in the 2016 race, probably because the Republicans will push that a lot harder, depending on what kind of candidate they have, because they will see a political advantage to it. I think this is one of the reasons Mitt Romney has decided to get back into the race, is because he thought he had foreign policy right, particularly with respect to Russia, and that's why he wants to do a redo, because he says, I had it right, and let's talk about that. I mean, there's other things, but I do think that foreign policy is one of the reasons why he wants to jump back in.
Okay, we're going to bounce back and forth, but we'll go here and there, and then back over there. Okay, we're here and there, and then we'll go there. All right.
The question I would have is, my name is Josiah Lippincott. I'm an intern here with the Center for Principles in Politics. My question relates specifically toward ISIS and what you see the primary threat being right now with the group, and where you see America's role. So what should America do about ISIS?
Well, I'll take a crack and you can too. All right. So a great question for those who didn't hear is about what should we be doing about ISIS. Here's what really concerns me about ISIS, how we're at a somewhat unprecedented moment since 9/11 in whatever you want to call the conflict, the war on terror, the war on Al-Qaeda. I mean, you know, the labeling is partly cosmetic, but actually there's some strategic principles and assumptions embedded in that. Really, for the first time now, we have a militant jihadist group that has essentially sovereign control over a large swath of territory. We haven't had that before. Al-Qaeda was kind of in Afghanistan by the Taliban's permission, and they had a symbiosis there. But I mean, you know, ISIS has really complete territorial control of large swaths of Iraq and Syria. That's new, and that brings with it some strategic advantages, such as terrorist training camps, more control over the population, more recruiting. Second, they now have a number of independent, ongoing revenue streams. Oil they're selling on the black market, ransoms, extortion, other things like that. Al-Qaeda before more or less relied on the philanthropy of some radical sheikhs in the Gulf and the bin Laden fortune. But ISIS now has this renewable revenue stream. And then third, they have a number of members and new recruits who have Western passports. Not just a few, but hundreds, thousands, having European and even American passports. And that brings a whole new level of power projection and malevolence and threat, whether it's going to be a large-scale attack or some smaller ones like the Charlie Hebdo one or some of these other ones we're seeing. And I suppose the fourth thing I would say is that they are at the 4.0 or 5.0 level in terms of social media presence. Al-Qaeda was pioneering some of that, but ISIS is at a whole nother level. They're way ahead of the game there, and that accounts for them winning a lot of the hearts and minds battle. And again, they don't have to win the allegiance of the entire Islamic world. I'd still say the vast majority of Muslims reject ISIS, don't buy that worldview, don't see them as the way to go. But all they need to do is get about 0.5% of Muslims out there, and that is still going to be millions of people. So those are things that worry me. Kim will tell you how we can fix fix it.
Well, no, well, yeah. I mean, one of the problems with trying to come up with anything that sounds workable or reasonable with respect to ISIS is based upon the fact that we didn't have to be in such a bad situation to begin with. We didn't have to get out of Iraq the way we did so quickly and completely abandoned it. Now we have a much more horrible situation than we could have had otherwise. And if somebody says, well, okay, well, that's water under the bridge, who cares? Well, I think it's important for us to remember that, because the next president of the United States is going to have to try to clean up this mess. And you can imagine that 30 days into the presidency, it's going to be that president's responsibility for everything. I mean, if Obama talked about how Bush was responsible for all these bad things, the next president, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, I think has a right to do the same thing. But I think the thing about, and I think you hit all the main points, but the one thing about ISIS that worries me the most is that I would be wary of trying to draw any direct conclusions or implications about what you think is going to happen there in the near term. It's highly unpredictable and highly unstable. I've seen some commentary where so long as ISIS is preoccupied just killing other Arabs and the like, that they're not, a, quote, an existential threat to the United States, so who cares? Just let them kill each other. I've heard that kind of analysis from people who otherwise, I think, consider themselves to be quite sophisticated. Who knows what kind of threat we're going to be facing from them? It could be the safe haven thing that you talked about, which could become much even worse, and there actually still are some chemical weapons in that area running around. They've already been used. And also you have a recipe for an expansion of an ever wider war in the Middle East. You've already got tremendous war inside Syria and Iraq. And the Iranians are always stoking the fires, and the Sunni-Shia fault line, of which the ISIS is a major player in, could be the source for a major expansion of warfare in the Middle East. There was just in the last couple of days another exchange between the Hezbollah and Israel. And so this could go on for a number of years, and this is not the kind of low-level instability that we've seen in the past. This could actually break out into a Middle East-wide war. And if that becomes the case, then we could find ourselves, because we thought that we could neglect it, because we thought, well, it's so hard to do what we need to do now that we just wait and see, perhaps maybe we can hope for the best, it'll get better. It keeps on getting steadily worse. The only thing I can say is that, yeah, we've got a very bad hand to play, particularly with respect to the way we've got ourselves in the corner with Syria, where we can't figure out who the enemy is. And one of the first things is any military strategist will tell you, if you can't figure out who your enemy is, there's no possible way you can be victorious. So it is truly a mess. But I do believe that unless we get straight what our objectives are, both military and political, we cannot possibly succeed. And I think that what's happening with this administration is they're just trying to run the clock out because they know it is too hard, and they're just going to leave it to the next president.
Rachel?
Thanks. I'm Rachel Hoff with the American Action Forum. And I wonder, in the lead up to a new foreign policy in 2016, if you might comment on the role that Congress can and should play, especially now, of course, with Republicans in control of both sides of the Hill. I suppose most obviously what role they can play on defense spending, although I think more interestingly, what role they can play or should play with regard to the Iran negotiations and perhaps even Russia and Iraq and Syria.
Can I take issue with your most interestingly? I do believe that Congress's role is getting the budget straight and to try to figure out how to fix the problem of sequestration on the defense budget. I think should be their top priority, their first order of business. That's constitutionally what they're supposed to do. They can do it, have to do it with the president. But that, Iran is always going to be the executive branch's lead, and then they do have a role in that. And I'm glad that they're playing a role of holding the administration's feet to the fire on this. But unless Republicans and Democrats fix this, this is going to simply get worse, and I just don't want some of my conservative friends to think it's somebody else's problem. I'm not suggesting that's what you think. But it was I just do think it's a higher priority than Iran, as important as Iran is.
I very much appreciate that question, Rachel, because this has been a little bit of a hobby horse of mine recently too, and this was not a planted question. But again, we've been at a somewhat unusual moment historically over the last 10 years or so, where Congress has, I think, really stepped back from playing its important and constitutionally mandated role in foreign and defense policy. If you compare it with, again, not to wax too nostalgic for the Cold War, but whether it's the Arthur Vandenbergs or the Scoop Jacksons, or even the Sam Nunns, my first boss in Washington, Barry Goldwater's, a lot of really important initiatives, not just responses to administration policies, but actually creative new initiatives on Defense Department reform, on rethinking the détente grand strategy towards the Soviet Union, reinvigorating promotion of freedom around the world. Those have been initiated by Congress, by some real giants who would study the issues, who would marshal broad bipartisan political coalitions, and who would drive the legislation through, and would sometimes do it cooperatively with the White House and the executive branch, and sometimes would do it in an adversarial way. But either way, we can point to, I think, some really important initiatives in American national security policy that came from Congress. Just hasn't been the case in the last 10, 15 years. I'd like to see that role reinvigorated. As a Republican myself, I think there's an especially apt moment now with a Republican Congress, and there's some promising new lights. Mac Thornberry, the HASC chair, is someone to be pretty excited about. Certainly, Senator McCain's going to be very, very active on this, and then some great new members. I mean, one underappreciated aspect about this new Senate class is, Tom Cotton, a vet, Dan Sullivan, a vet, who also had senior positions in the Bush NSC and the State Department, Joni Ernst, a vet. We've got, even among people who've only been, called senator for a few weeks now, we've got some great expertise and experience in national security policy, and we need to, empower those voices to be heard. But look, if we have a Republican presidency, and I hope we do in 2016, I still hope Congress will be more involved, just in a, constructive way, of course. So if this is being taped, I don't want someone to throw those words back at me. Okay.
So I want to get my cues straight.
Can I just say, it's also worth reminding that NATO expansion came through a contract with America,
Right.
and also NAFTA was pretty much a congressional thing.
There you go.
So Emil, and then I saw a hand in the back, and then this gentleman, and then Ted. So we're going to go first.
Emil Main at the Heritage Foundation. Kim, I want to ask you, I think it was you that raised this idea of kind of relative strength. I think it's fair to say that most Americans have kind of take for granted the idea that we can engage in conventional warfare. We might not be great at nation building, but we can engage in conventional warfare with relative ease without a significant loss of life. And, given the sort of trajectory of what we're doing to our defense capabilities, does it really just rely on the president to be able to communicate why we need to make the sorts of investment in defense to maintain that superiority in the long term?
Well, it's mainly the president's job, not exclusively. The Congress has a role here as well. It's at that level, it's mainly about trying to show the American people that if we're going to find ourselves in a war, our soldiers and sailors are going to have the equipment and the military capability to prevail. They're not going to know what that is, how many tanks that is, and how many ships it is. They're going to rely on their leaders, both in Congress and in the White House, to figure that out. But I do think that there is one perception that is, I think, very important, and that is that some American military experts, some national defense experts, seem to think that we have more leeway in this relative strength competition with countries like Russia and China than we actually do. They'll use static comparisons about how many tanks or aircraft China has compared to us, or Russia has compared to us. And then this is one of the great things that Jim is doing with this military index, is he's trying to get a more comprehensive and dynamic measurement of what military power is between nations. And we'll find out it's very complex. It is relative, and it's very contingency based, and all sorts of other things that are brought into it. But it's just, for example, think about Russia. I mean, Russia is using military force. It's inside Ukraine. It's putting brigades and tanks and other heavy military hardware inside Ukraine. The Europeans and we are not doing that. What does that tell you? It tells you they're willing to use force and we're not. And so, as far as I'm not recommending we use force. I'm just saying this is how you, in the relationship of who cares more about Ukraine, Russia or us. Obviously, Russia does because they're willing to use force to do it. And so, all of these talks about Russia's military being weak and can't take on the United States is utterly irrelevant in that particular equation because of the other factors that are involved. It's the same thing with China's little tiny navy compared to our wonderful Pacific Navy. I mean, they are no comparison in terms of the numbers. But that is not the only issue. The only issue is what do the other countries like the Philippines and the others who may have contested territorial claims in the islands and elsewhere with China, some of whom are like Japan are our allies. Do they believe that we will back them up if there's a military dispute with China? And where China's military force is in proximity to what's happening, a lot closer than we are, and that the local balance of power, even globally, is much more significant than the global one. And so these are the kinds of things that I think a lot of defense experts lose. I mean, how many times have you heard that America, spends more on national defense than 34 countries combined, or something like that? I don't know what the number is. And I always say, but America's a superpower. It's got allies. It's a world leader. And, these other countries don't have those kinds of responsibilities. This kind of perspective is important, I think, about looking at relative strength.
So a question of that. Yeah, sounds good.
I'm Nils Lange. I'm from with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I'm from Germany. So excuse my English, please. I have two questions. One question to Dr. Holmes regarding the conflict in the Ukraine. Do you think that the European Union would have better not try to associate the Ukraine to the Union, or that the US should have been part of this process since the beginning? And the second question to both of you, what do you think, which role will play Condoleezza Rice in the 2016 election? Maybe as a supporter of a candidate or as a candidate for herself? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think the problem was the European Union associates agreement with the Ukraine by itself. I think that had been in the works for some times, and I think that the problem is that there was a perception in Ukraine and also in Moscow that the United States was not involved in a different, and therefore the whole NATO equation didn't seem to be as a deterrent on as far as the Russians are concerned, the fact that the Americans may actually be not very happy if it starts getting out of hand and they do all the things that they're doing in Ukraine. I just think that somehow Vladimir Putin got the idea that the United States was disengaged, somewhat indifferent. He was leaving this up mainly to the Europeans to take the lead. And so logically and naturally, he could draw the conclusion from that, that given the events as they developed, that he could use force and be much more forward-leaning than he could have been otherwise. That's what I meant by it. We should have been more engaged, and so we could giving the message to the Russians that don't go there and do that. There was just no credibility even after it happened when President Obama said basically just that. It wasn't believed. I'll let you talk about Condi Rice.
Okay. Well, on the Condi Rice question, you heard this here first. I think if you want to figure out what Condi Rice's future is going to be, the single most important thing to look at is not who's jumping in the Republican primary or anything like that. It's how does Roger Goodell handle the Deflategate scandal with the Patriots deflating their footballs. I'm only partially kidding, actually. She has said before that her dream job would be NFL commissioner. And if he doesn't weather this one, after he kind of blew the Ray Rice one, and that job comes open, my money's on her. Slightly more seriously. And again, I'm only half kidding with that, like I said. So what starts as a joke sometimes can become a reality. I've known her a long time. I was a student of hers at Stanford a long time ago and then worked for her at the State Department, but I'm not terribly close to her, so I don't want to overprivilege this at all. My sense from my conversations with her and others who know her well is that she has very little interest in running for office herself. I think she plays kind of the younger Henry Kissinger role pretty well, of the elder stateswoman. Not that she's old, but in terms of she's very seasoned. She's already been a Secretary of State. And just about every leading Republican wants to have conversations with her, seek advice and guidance from her. She did that in 2012 for Mitt Romney. She's, I think, doing that for anyone who calls now. The only thing, though, to keep in mind is she is particularly close to the Bush family. And you may have seen that she's going to be overseeing Jeb's Education Foundation now, as he's stepping away from those roles. You know, if she were, I don't know who her favorite will be in the primary. You know, not for me to speculate on, but I do know she's very close to the Bush family. And I wouldn't be surprised if she at least gets mentioned when it comes time for picking a running mate for whoever the Republican nominee is. And there might be some entreaties there. I have no idea if she'd want to do that or not. It might depend on if she's running the NFL at the time, or how Stanford football is doing at the time, for that matter. So we'll see. But she is an exceptionally talented American. She's a national treasure. I'm a big fan of hers, and I hope that she continues to find very meaningful leadership roles, whatever they may be.
So we have a question down here in the center, and I know Ted had a question. Maybe we'll squeeze one more in after that. So you, sir?
Thank you. Gerald Chandler. Could you comment on what you think the changes in personnel in the Obama administration since the 2012 election, what do they mean as far as direction of foreign policy, changing from Hillary Clinton to Secretary Kerry, having Ben Rhodes be the apparent spokesman for the White House instead of Susan Rice? Does that indicate that these administration is moving closer or farther away from the points of view that you've advocated?
I don't know that I would read too much into the particular appointments about which either way it was going. The foreign policy in this administration is very much controlled by the White House, with a heavy dose of the political influence from the people around the president. There was some talk of Susan Rice being Secretary of State. We all know that didn't work out, and why. But she is and has been part of the inner circle. So to that extent, to the extent that there's been any changes, for example, realizing that reset didn't work and changing course on Russia, that's sort of the natural course of events, I think, that was decided by the political people around the president and the president himself. And I don't see any great change as a result of John Kerry's leadership. He mainly is a figure who is not in the inner circle. He's sort of executing the foreign policy because it's mainly made in the White House. So I guess to answer your question is I don't think the personnel is as important as just that the president himself responding to events.
And I'll just add on that I agree with everything Kim said. The Obama administration has centralized control on national security policy in the White House to a degree not seen since the Nixon White House. As far as state and the Pentagon being almost irrelevant when it comes to the making of policy. They still are the ones with the resources for executing it, but as far as the making of it. I'm actually somewhat agnostic on what's the ideal org chart for an administration. I just think a president has to figure out what he or she wants and what works best. So whether it's more cabinet government or more centralization, there's pros and cons either way. It's just about whatever you do decide making it work. What can be said, the reason it kind of worked for Nixon and Kissinger is you happen to have two strategic geniuses. So if you centralize control and you're a strategic genius, then maybe you can make it work. If you think they had a good foreign policy, and overall I think that they had more successes than failures. I have not seen similar strategic genius from the Obama administration, and so I think the problem is only tangentially one of the centralization of control in the org chart. I think it's more just this president's particular view of the world and how it's been a bad idea, poorly implemented.
Okay, so we'll go to the back, then we'll go to Ted. Then we'll get to the lightning round.
Okay. Hi, my name is Nadia Chow, Washington correspondent for the Liberty Times. I think the Obama administration is pretty proud of one area in terms of foreign policy is Asia. But from what you just commented, you don't seem to agree with that. I just wonder if the next president will be the Republican. What can he do to make a difference, especially in terms of the China policy? We see now China is not only trying to compete, but they're trying to set new rules, to build a new institution based on China's interest. So we were told in this town that the China policy from the U.S. administration is quite consistent over the years. But what can we expect from a new government? Thank you.
Yeah, I can.
I'll wing a few thoughts and then Kim can.
No, I can do it.
Okay, go ahead. All right. Okay.
You know, of all of our regional strategies, probably Asia has the most bipartisan support. It's most stable. It changes less than some of the other. The most unstable is obviously the Middle East. And Europe for many years was fairly stable, but it's becoming less so now because of what the Russians are doing. But Asia is fairly stable. So we shouldn't be surprised that it is doing as well as it is. Our alliances in Asia are relatively strong. They have been that way for some time. I don't know that the Obama administration itself is particularly the reason why they're strong. I'm glad what they've done recently with respect to reinvigorating our relationships with India. That's a good thing, but of course it did lay dormant for a number of years, and we could have done that earlier. All of this to say is that there was the famous pivot strategy, but I agree with Will that it was more rhetoric than it was real. But at least it was something. It was rhetoric, and it was telling our allies and friends in Asia that we still cared about Asia. So to that extent, it was important. I think that what the next president has to do is try to come to terms with China in the long run. Our policy towards China is frankly schizophrenic, whether you're Democrat or Republican. Or at least ambivalent. To the extent, on the one hand, we want to have trade and commercial relations with China. There's sort of the hope and expectation that that will result in some kind of transformation of China's society. It's not happening, but we always sort of hope that would happen. But at the same time, as China gets richer and as it flexes its muscles in the region, particularly with respect to territorial disputes in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and also in addition to statements it's made, it's clear they want the United States strategically to be pushed back further from their borders and from the territorial waters which they care about. So this is very complicated, and Republican or Democrat has been trying to balance this, these two kinds of objectives, which are not always in sync. But I will say one thing that I wish that the next president would do, if it's a Republican or a Democrat, is that, and that is to let the Chinese understand that we will support our allies and friends, the Japanese, the Philippines, and others, if they do press their territorial claims too hard. There should be no question about that. It doesn't mean that we try to expect the Japanese and others to be overly aggressive, but the point is that we don't want there to be any question in the minds of the leadership in Beijing that we do not support our allies. And that would at least signal to the Chinese leadership that the United States' strategic presence in Asia is permanent, and we can talk about the details with the Chinese where we have disputes and disagreements. That's fine, but we don't want to give the impression that we think this is simply too hard, or that we don't back our allies and therefore we can be pushed out.
Let's have a thought in addition to that, because I agree with just about everything Kim said there, which is that since the end of the Cold War, since the Tiananmen Square massacre, American policy towards China has been, across all administrations, from Bush 41 through Clinton through Bush 43 through Obama, has been based on a strategic bet. And that bet has been this, that as we economically engage with China, as China becomes more prosperous and liberalizes its economy, that it will also liberalize its political system. It'll become more free, and it'll become a more benign international actor, a responsible stakeholder, as Bob Zellick has put it before. That bet has failed, hasn't worked. It was plausible. I supported it back in the 90s when I worked on the Hill and was helping with China's WTO accession, things like that. It had a certain internal logic to it, and we looked at other past analogies of South Korea's democratic transition or Taiwan or others, but it hasn't worked. And we now have a China that is wealthier, but is also a more aggressive international actor and has, if anything, backslidden on political reforms, whether it's religious freedom or media freedom or internet freedom or treatment of ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or what have you. And so it's time for a fundamental rethink, I think, of the overall American strategic posture towards China. We don't want a war with them, but I think we need to create a better international environment in the region so that China is incentivized for better behavior and is deterred from its more aggressive behavior. And we have let our alliances erode. We're not doing very well with the Australians. We've been humiliating poor Prime Minister Abbott. Prime Minister Abe in Japan is a little frustrated with us. We're trying to get things back on track with the Indians after several years of neglect. But I think it's that alliance structure is key. And reinvigorating support for more freedom-minded Chinese, who I think have felt very neglected by this administration.
Can I say one thing very quickly, Jim? This is, I think I agree with that entirely. This is one of the reasons why the China and Vietnam analogy that was used to justify the opening of relations with Cuba doesn't work. It's fine for them to say that over 50 years of embargo hasn't changed Cuba. Well, they're right. That they got a point there. But the analogy that said, well, look what's happening in China. How China is much more richer, and Vietnam is now we got relations with. Isn't that what we want to do? Well, the fact is that it's consolidated the leadership of the Communist Party in both places, and. So they may, I don't think, frankly, that Cuba will even change anywhere near what the Chinese have done. But the point is that it's not going to get rid of the Communist Party in Cuba.
So I haven't forgot my list. So on the three side, you've got revitalized counterterrorism strategy, defense investment, a new Russia strategy, and on the carrot side, free trade agenda, free market energy agenda, and revitalizing key alliances. Okay, so here's the ringer question. So I'll give Kim the easy one because he used to be my boss. So if your president if your president follows this for 8 years, what is the most optimistic view of the world you could give me?
He said it was going to be easy. I had to predict.
Wait till you hear the other one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when it comes to international relations, my God, if we can avoid major wars and conflicts, our expectations don't necessarily be too high. But if I could see a situation where all the major things that we listed as the problems were, which was terrorism, Russia, and defense. They cannot be turned around overnight. But if we had a situation where on counterterrorism we had a more comprehensive strategy and we started to get a handle on what's happening in Iraq and Syria, at least if those wars are winding down to where we can see some kind of an end in sight, that would be a positive thing. If we saw our military capability returning, where we would start to be respected around the world, and we find that perhaps we're not as tested at the margins as we would used to be. As far as the Russians are concerned, the sanctions held, and the Russians have, because perhaps the declining energy prices, maybe even internal disorder, to realize that Mr. Putin is not the man to lead Russia, and they get some new leadership there, and that we can have some hope that maybe Russia wants to join some kind of a European space of, if not democracy, then at least stability and order. This is not where they are right now. I could go around the world, but I mean, those are three things that I'd settle for.
All right. So, Will, if we didn't do any of these things, what's the worst the world could look like 8 years, or I guess 10 years from now?
Oh gosh! So if they don't follow
that's a lot easier to do.
If they don't follow the Holmes, Imboden, all right, well, apocalyptic doom. That's right.
Yeah,
so
doom is easy.
the end of human
Is it
existence.
the zombie apocalypse or what?
No. A more realistic bad case scenario I would be setting aside again, nuclear holocaust if the terrorists get their hands on several nuclear devices or something. Almost too horrible to contemplate, although it does need to be addressed. More realistic one would be a United States that is forced both by circumstance and choice to just retreat behind our own borders and try to hole up here in North America. So you would have the Eurasian landmass dominated by a kind of a Russian-Chinese partnership where the Russians sort of control their half of the hemisphere, and then China dominates the Asia Pacific. Eventually, there might be a rivalry there, but they could work out that condominium. They already are with some of their strategic and energy partnerships, and then in a Middle East that is a combination of chaos, failed states, despotism, and a growing, an increasingly strong Islamic State that consolidates its control, as we were talking about earlier, and is able to project power and threats into the Western Hemisphere. I mean, an underreported thing has been, Hezbollah activities in Venezuela, for example. And so, even if we do retreat into a sort of a fortress America, where these problems could encroach and come our way, and also leave the homeland more vulnerable to terrorist attacks. So, no, I don't see us all speaking Russian and Chinese in a few years when we're invaded. I would not be near that dire. But I do see the possibility of a fundamental reordering of the globe, where our adversaries have a much stronger hand, and we just have to hunker down.
Could I just ask him? Do you see any possibility of another strategic surprise, and what might it be?
Well, there's always another possibility of a strategic surprise, but if I told you what it was, it wouldn't be a surprise. So.
This is where you're supposed to say it's cyber.
Okay. That too. Yeah, that's right. So,
Well, even so, those are actually two fairly stunningly contrasting visions. I mean, so you talk about choices having consequences. I mean, basically, if you follow that through, what you're telling is a small child in grammar school, you'd say by the time you graduate high school, the world that you know could be an entirely different place. I think that's stunning when you think about the magnitude of the consequences of the decisions of the next couple of years. Well, I'm going to ask everybody to join me in thanking our panelists. Remind everybody that we'll be online, that they can view it later. Thank you all for coming.